All right, welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Always great to have you. And today we're going to be, as always, diving deep into some fascinating research.
Yeah.
Our topic today is sampling techniques. Have you ever heard of this? Sampling techniques.
Yeah, I have.
So basically, this is how researchers figure out how to choose the right group of people to, study when they can't study everybody.
Right. It's like you can't ask everyone in the world a question. So you got to figure out how to ask a smaller group and then make sure that smaller group represents everybody.
Yeah, it's like, if you want to know what flavor of ice cream is the best, you can't ask everybody in the entire world what their favorite is.
Exactly.
You got to pick, like a representative group.
Right. And you got to be really careful how you pick that group.
Yeah, that's what all this research is talking about. What are the ways, the techniques the researchers use to do this right, to pick the right group?
And it gets complicated.
So maybe we could start with just like a super basic definition. What is sampling? Why do we even need sampling techniques in the first place?
Well, think about it this way. Imagine you want to know what people think about a new law. Or maybe you're a company and you want to know if people like your new product. There's no way you could ask literally everyone their opinion. It would take forever. So sampling lets you get information from a smaller group, and then you can use that information to make guesses about what the larger group thinks.
And I guess the trick is, or the art of it, is making sure that small group really does reflect the bigger group, right?
Absolutely. You want your sample to be representative of the population you're interested in. Like, if you only ask your friends what they think of that new law, your results might be kind of biased.
Right, because all your friends might think the same way.
Exactly. So you got to be strategic about how you choose your sample. And that's where sampling techniques come in.
And according to this stack of research, which, by the way, is quite a stack this time, it looks like there are two main categories. So there's probability sampling and non-probability sampling.
That's right. And they're pretty different beasts, those two.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about, what's the big difference between these two main approaches?
Well, probability sampling is all about randomness and making sure everyone has an equal chance of being selected.
Okay.
Non-probability sampling is a bit more relaxed on that front. It's often used when it's just not feasible or practical to get a perfectly random sample.
I see. So it's like probability sampling is the gold standard.
It often is, yes, because that randomness helps you minimize bias and increases the chances that your sample is truly representative of the whole population.
Okay, so in a perfect world, everyone would use probability sampling.
In a perfect world, maybe, but the real world is messy. Sometimes you just can't track down every single person in the population you're interested in.
Right, or maybe it's way too expensive to try to do that.
Exactly. So non-probability sampling gives you other options, even if they might be a bit less precise.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's dig a little deeper into each of these categories. You mentioned that probability sampling has a bunch of different methods under its umbrella.
It does. There's simple random sampling, stratified sampling, cluster sampling, and systematic sampling. Each one has its own quirks and ways of trying to achieve that lovely randomness.
All right, so break it down for me. Simple random sampling, that sounds pretty straightforward.
It is. Think of it like putting everyone's name in a giant hat and picking out a handful of names at random. Everyone has an equal chance of being selected.
Okay, so simple in theory, but how does that actually work in real life? Are researchers really using giant hats?
Haha, not usually. They might use computer programs to generate random numbers or use other techniques to make sure the selection is truly random.
Gotcha. So what about stratified sampling? How's that different?
So stratified sampling is useful when you know there are important subgroups within your population that you need to make sure are represented in your sample.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure, let's say you're doing a study on exercise habits. You might want to make sure you have an even split of men and women in your sample because you know that exercise habits can vary between genders.
Makes sense. So you divide the population into those groups first, and then randomly select people from each group.
Exactly. You're essentially creating mini random samples within each of those subgroups or strata.
I like that, mini random samples. So what about cluster sampling? That one sounds kind of tricky.
Cluster sampling can be a lifesaver when you're dealing with massive populations spread out over a large geographic area.
Okay, how so?
Imagine you're researching teaching methods in elementary schools across an entire state. It wouldn't be very practical to randomly select individual students from every single school, would it?
No, that sounds like a logistical nightmare.
Right. So instead, you might randomly select a certain number of schools. Those schools would be your clusters, and then you'd study all the students within those chosen schools.
So you're basically randomly picking groups of people instead of individuals.
Exactly. It can be much more efficient, especially when you're dealing with huge populations.
And last but not least, we have systematic sampling. What's that all about?
Systematic sampling is all about patterns. Think of it like this. You decide you want to survey every 10th person who walks into a store. You pick a random starting point, like the third person, and then you stick to that pattern.
So it's random, but also kind of organized.
Exactly. It can be a really efficient way to get a decent sample, especially if you don't have a list of everyone in your population to choose from randomly.
All right, so we've covered the probability sampling side of things. Now let's venture into the world of non-probability sampling.
Let's do it.
You mentioned that this is where things get a little bit more loosey-goosey.
You could say that. Remember, with non-probability sampling, not everyone in the population has a chance of being selected. It's often based on convenience, or the researcher might be intentionally targeting specific types of people for their study.
Got it. So convenience sampling, that one sounds pretty self-explanatory.
It is. It's basically grabbing whoever's easiest to reach, like asking your coworkers to fill out a survey or standing on a street corner and interviewing whoever walks by.
Easy peasy, but probably not the most accurate way to get a truly representative sample.
Right. There's a good chance you'll end up with a lot of bias in your sample because you're not really controlling who gets included.
Okay, what about this one? Judgmental or purposive sampling? That sounds kind of fancy.
It can be a powerful technique when you need to get very specific information from a very specific group of people.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Imagine you're studying the effects of a new leadership training program. You might decide to only include CEOs of Fortune 500 companies in your sample.
So you're deliberately choosing people who fit a very specific profile. Got it.
Exactly. It all depends on what you're trying to learn.
What about quota sampling? How is that different from stratified sampling?
Quota sampling aims for representation, but it's not quite as random as stratified sampling.
Also.
Let's say you're researching consumer preferences for a new type of phone. You might decide you want your sample to reflect the age demographics of your target market.
Okay, so you'd set quotas like 20% of your sample has to be between 18 and 25, 30% between 26 and 35, and so on.
Exactly. And you'd keep recruiting people until you meet those quotas.
It sounds kind of like stratified sampling, but without the random selection within each group.
You got it.
Okay, and finally, there's snowball sampling. Is that like a chain letter or something?
Kind of. It's a great technique when you're trying to study hard-to-reach populations.
Okay, give me an example.
Let's say you're researching the experiences of undocumented immigrants. It can be very difficult to find people willing to participate in a study because of the risks involved.
All right, that makes sense.
So you might start with a few people you know who trust you and ask them to connect you with others they know who might also be willing to participate.
So it's like you start with a small snowball, and it gradually rolls around, picking up more and more snow as it goes.
Exactly. It can be a really effective way to reach people who might otherwise be hidden or reluctant to come forward.
Wow. So we've covered, what, like 8 different sampling techniques?
That's right.
My brain is officially full.
Uh-huh. I hear you. It's a lot to take in.
But it's fascinating stuff, right?
Yeah.
But, I mean, now that I know all this, I'm going to look at every survey and every study I come across with a whole new perspective.
That's the goal.
I'm going to be like, I wonder what kind of sampling technique they used. Did they get a truly representative sample?
Exactly. Understanding sampling techniques is like having a superpower. It helps you see through the numbers and think critically about how information is gathered and presented.
So next time you see a poll or a study that claims to represent, I don't know, like the views of the American people,
Ooh, yeah.
you got to ask yourself, how did they choose those people?
Right. Who's missing from this picture?
Because the way they pick those people could make a huge difference in the results.
It absolutely can. A poorly chosen sample can lead to misleading or even completely wrong conclusions.
So the takeaway here is, folks, be skeptical. Ask questions. Don't just blindly accept what you read, because now you know the secrets of sampling techniques.
You're armed with knowledge.
All right, thank you so much for diving deep with us today. This has been another fascinating deep dive into the world of research, and we'll see you next time.